Okay, so we are to the judges again, and just as a reminder of the different judges that we have seen so far, we started with Othniel and then Ehud, and they each did very well and lasted a long time. Then we had this real short minor judge named Shamgar. There's only one verse about him. It doesn't even say how long he was judge. Then we had Deborah for 40 years and Gideon for 40 years. And of course, with Gideon, we start a turning point. Each one of these is worse than the one before, but with Gideon, we really start this turning point downhill where he said all the right things, but did all the wrong things. I put Abimelech on there. He's not technically a judge. He's sort of an anti-judge. He thinks he's a king. He claims that his dad was a king and tries to rule as a king, and it's a disaster, and that's 3 years. And then we were told last week about these two minor judges, Tola and Jair. We weren't told a whole lot about them, but you can see the decrease in time of their rule. And then we spent last week looking at Jephthah, and Jephthah ruled 6 years, and it was not a very good rule. Then we got to chapter 12, and once we got to 12, we were told about these three judges, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, that ruled 7, 10, and 8 years. And there's not a whole lot about them, and they're minor judges, and we're not going to pay too much attention to them. And after Abdon, we come to the last and the best known judge, and that is Samson. Samson rules for 20 years. Most people only know about Samson and Delilah, mainly because of that Cecil DeMille movie, Samson and Delilah, which was quite popular and famous. It's a good story, the Samson story. It's got elements of other archetype, mythological type stories like Hercules and Robin Hood in it. And the narrative storytelling elements in it are really, really good. And so it's a story that has fascinated the imaginations of people for many, many years. Unfortunately, though, people don't really know the whole story. They just know kind of the highlights and the parts of it. And they think that Samson is this great Bible hero. That's how he is depicted in Sunday school classes, but that's not actually true. So at the time of Samson's birth, we've got the downward spiral of Israel is almost at the bottom. So we'd be kind of down here at this point. And again, well, we see that the Israelites do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. In the first verse of chapter 13, by the way, we're going to split Samson into two parts. I can't remember if I said that. Samson will be this week and next week. And then we will have our last week, which is where we look at everything after Samson and sort of the very beginning of Samuel. So we've got 3 weeks left, counting this week, and then we'll be done with this study. So the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. So we have this familiar pattern that we've seen over and over and over again throughout Judges. They do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord gives them into the hand of the Philistines. Remember, last week it was the Ammonites and the Philistines, but now the Ammonites have been taken care of by Jephthah. So we've got the Philistines that still need to be dealt with. But the pattern is broken here because this time the Israelites do not cry out to the Lord. That's the pattern that we've seen, that they do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, meaning worship idols. They are given into the hands of some sort of oppressor, and then they cry out to the Lord, and the Lord sends a deliverer. But this time they do not cry out to the Lord. In fact, what we see in this story is that they are perfectly content to be ruled by the Philistines. They don't recognize that the Philistines are their oppressors. They recognize the Philistines as their rightful rulers. We see it in chapter 15, we'll come to this next week. But 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" He has fought with some Philistines, and they get really worried because they know that they're ruled by the Philistines. And they actually, again, this will be part of next week's story, they actually capture Samson and turn him over to the Philistines. So they have no clue that God is supposed to be their ruler. They believe that they are ruled by the Philistines. It's all that they can remember. So they're not crying out to the Lord for deliverance. Nevertheless, God still wants to deliver them. God still remains faithful to them. And in the book of Judges, God is all about saving the Israelites, delivering the Israelites, not because the people deserve it, not because the people ask for it, but simply because he loves them and wants to give them a deliverance. So he raises up another deliverer. That's going to be Samson, but Samson's story starts before he's even born. And things are so bad that the next deliverer can't be called from among the people who are already alive. The next deliverer has to be set apart from birth. So we go on. There was a certain man of Zorah, of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. His wife was barren, having borne no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "Although you are barren, having borne no children, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now, be careful not to drink wine or strong drink or to eat anything unclean, for you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor is to come on his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from birth. It is he who shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines." So we have this angelic announcement that's meant to set Samson apart, like many other barren women in Scripture, until we get to the ultimate barren woman, which is the Virgin Mary. But notice here in this last verse, it is he who shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. So right up front, we are told that the deliverance is not going to be complete. So we've hit a new low. With every other one, there's been sort of a complete deliverance of the people. With Jephthah, there was a complete deliverance from the Ammonites, but not the Philistines. But now, this deliverer is not even going to be able to completely deliver the Israelites. And we'll see why as the story goes along. But this is a major clue that the narrator gives us at the beginning of the story to let us know right up front that Samson is not the deliverer that Israel will need. He is not going to be the hero that everybody expects. So Samson should not be seen as a hero story, despite whatever you learn in Sunday school. He's going to fail. He's going to fail miserably. He's going to be completely unfaithful to God, and he is not going to fulfill the destiny that God has called him to. And so that may be a surprise, because in Sunday school, we always learn that Samson's a hero. We tend to think of him that way because of the Cecil B. DeMille movie. But when we look at the whole story, it's just not the case. He is a selfish, self-centered man who's focused on his own desires and his own slights. Unfortunately, God chooses to work through humans, and human beings are flawed. And so sometimes the humans that God calls lean into their flaws and are not able to accomplish God's purposes. And it's going to become clear over time that Samson is a very flawed hero. But at this point in the story, we don't expect that. At this point in the story, there is every expectation that Samson will be a hero. We just have this one little hint that maybe not everything is as it seems. Everything else sort of tells us that. A Nazarite, by the way, the word Nazarite means one who is separated, set apart, one who is consecrated. And it comes from Numbers chapter 6. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when either men or women make a special vow, the vow of a Nazarite, to separate themselves to the Lord, they shall separate themselves from wine and strong drink. They shall drink no wine vinegar or other vinegar, and shall not drink any grape juice or eat grapes, fresh or dried. All their days as Nazarenes, they shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. All the days of their Nazarite vow, no razor shall come upon the head until the time is completed for which they separate themselves to the Lord. They shall be holy, that means set apart. They shall let the locks of the head grow long. All the days that they separate themselves to the Lord, they shall not go near a corpse. Even if their father or mother, brother or sister should die, they may not defile themselves, because their consecration to God is upon the head. All their days as Nazarenes, they are holy to the Lord. So what you'll notice there is it talks about this Nazarite vow, but it's not a permanent vow. The Nazarite vow was meant to be a temporary vow for doing the Lord's business for a time, for a season. And the rest of chapter 6 gives all the rules for how to end the Nazarite vow and go back to normal living. But the crisis in Israel is so bad right now that the Israelites need a lifelong Nazarite, someone who is a Nazarite even before they're born. So the vow starts with the mother. The mother isn't supposed to drink any wine or eat anything from the grapevine. And Samson's going to have to be a Nazarite his entire life if he wants to accomplish God's purposes. That's what Samson's mother ends up telling her husband. Then the woman came and told her husband, "A man of God came to me, and his appearance was like that of an angel of God, most awe-inspiring. I did not ask him where he came from, and he did not tell me his name, but he said to me, 'You shall conceive and bear a son. So then drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from birth to the day of his death.'" Now, the angel didn't actually say that, but that is what the woman hears, from birth to the day of his death. So it kind of anticipates the premature death that Samson is going to have. And then the story continues. Then Manoah entreated the Lord and said, "O Lord, I pray, let the man of God whom you sent come to us again and teach us what we are to do concerning the boy who will be born." Apparently he doesn't believe his wife. God listened to Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman as she sat in the field, but her husband Manoah was not with her. So the woman ran quickly and told her husband, "The man who came to me the other day has appeared to me." Manoah got up and followed his wife and came to the man and said to him, "Are you the man who spoke to this woman?" And he said, "I am." Then Manoah said, "Now when your words come true, what is to be the boy's rule of life? What is he to do?" So he's asking this messenger, what am I supposed to do as a father for this boy? What's he going to be? And the angel kind of puts him in his place. The angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "Let the woman give heed to all I said to her." In other words, I already told the woman. I ain't telling you. If you don't believe her, fine. But she knows the deal. She may not eat of anything that comes from the vine. She's not to drink strong wine or strong drink or eat any unclean thing. She is to observe everything that I commanded her. And Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, "Allow us to detain you and prepare a kid for you." That's a hospitality thing. Then the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "If you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you want to prepare a burnt offering, then offer it to the Lord." For Manoah did not know that he was the angel of the Lord. Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, "What is your name, so that we may honor you when your words come true?" But the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why do you ask my name? It is too wonderful." So Manoah took the kid with the grain offering and offered it on the rock to the Lord, to him who works wonders. And then we see the same sort of thing happen that we saw back with Gideon. When the flame went up toward heaven from the altar, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar, while Manoah and his wife looked on, and they fell on their faces to the ground. The angel of the Lord did not appear again to Manoah and his wife. Then Manoah realized that it was the angel of the Lord, and Manoah said to his wife, "We shall surely die, for we have seen God." But his wife said to him, "If the Lord had meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering at our hands, or shown us all these things, or now announced to us such things as these." So it's a long birth story, preparing us for what we're going to hear. The hospitality section may sound familiar to you. It recalls when Abraham stopped, the three messengers stopped by, and he killed the calf for them and cooked for them, and then they told him that he was going to have a son. It also recalls the when Jacob wrestles with the angel and asks for the name of who he's been wrestling with. So we get this sense that this is a significant moment for Israel. Like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this child to be born is going to be special. So I'm going to unmute everybody. Comments about that? Anything you want to ask about that or that it brings up for you? All right, I'm not hearing anything, so mute everybody again. Okay, so the birth story completes then at the end of chapter 13 with the final two verses. The woman bore a son and named him Samson. The boy grew, and the Lord blessed him. The Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So this sounds promising, but I just want to point out that again we have this verb begin, just like we had that Samson would begin to deliver his people. Again, the Lord begins to stir in him. It puts us on alert. We have no doubt that Samson is going to be gifted. The question is going to be, what is he going to do with his gifts? Is he going to use them for the Lord or for his own selfish gain? Right now, the hope is that he's going to use his gifts for the Lord. But as the story unfolds, we're going to see that he uses his gifts for his own selfish gain, primarily the pursuit of women and getting revenge on those who stand in his way of pursuing women. He's not a great guy, Samson. So even though he has impressive strength and he does very entertaining feats, what we're going to see is ultimately Samson does absolutely nothing to actually deliver God's people from the Philistines. In fact, he never even attempts to rally the people to rise up against the Philistines. He spends his entire life focused on his own selfish pursuits. So Samson is born. He grows and is blessed. The Spirit of the Lord begins to stir in him, and his first great deed is to fall in love with a Philistine woman. Once Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw a Philistine woman. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw a Philistine woman at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among your kin or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, because she pleases me. His father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, for he was seeking a pretext to act against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So his very first act is an act of unfaithfulness. At the beginning of Judges, they are told they are not to make covenants with the inhabitants of the land. Marriage is a covenant. So they are also told you're not supposed to marry an inhabitant of the land. So he's breaking God's instructions to Israel, but he's also violating his Nazarite status because he wants to sleep with this woman, and sleeping with a foreigner in Jewish law makes you unclean. And as a Nazarite, he's supposed to remain clean. So it shows that he really doesn't care about the vow to be a Nazarite. And his parents recognize this is a problem. But Samson proves that he can be quite persistent at getting what he wants. The narrator tries to let Samson off the hook here just a little bit. We saw that with Jephthah last week. The narrator sometimes tries to let them off the hook. His father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, for he was seeking a pretext to act against the Philistine. But here's the thing. The Lord doesn't need a pretext to act against the Philistines. God always opposes oppression and injustice, and that's what was happening with the Philistines. In other translations, if you have the NIV or some other translations, they translate this pretext. They translate that word as an opportunity or occasion, and that's actually a pretty good translation. The Lord was seeking an opportunity to act against the Philistines or an occasion to act against the Philistines. Makes more sense. Still, it's trying to let the Israelites or let Samson off the hook. So Samson gets his way, and he goes down to Timnah. There's more than one problem with Timnah. It's not just that there are attractive Philistine women down there. Timnah is a place with vineyards that we learn. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and when he came to the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion roared at him. Now remember, the Nazarenes are supposed to avoid anything having to do with vineyards or grapevines. We saw that here. They shall drink no wine, vinegar, or other vinegar. They shall not drink any grape juice, eat grapes. They shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, even the seeds or the skins. So Timnah is a place where temptations abound for Samson. So when this young lion comes and roars at him, what might be the function? I'm going to unmute. Can anybody guess what might be the function of the lion roaring at him as he goes into Timnah?
Remind him.
Warning.
Warning against.
Beware.
Yeah, exactly right. This is the Lord warning Samson to stay away from Timnah. And we see often in the scriptures, for instance, in Amos, that the Lord is often considered to be a roaring lion. The Lord roars from Zion, utters his voice from Jerusalem. The lion has roared, who will not fear? The Lord has spoken. So we get this idea that maybe this is God warning Samson that he's not doing the right thing, that he needs to stay away from Timnah. If that's the case, Samson does not get the message at all. The Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he tore the lion apart barehanded, as one might tear apart a kid. That's not a child, that's a goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. So granted, we're told that it's the Spirit of the Lord that enables him to do this, but it is Samson using the Spirit of the Lord, and he's using it against the Lord's will at this point. He doesn't tell his parents because maybe his parents take the Nazarite vow a little more seriously than he does, which is not very seriously. He's also not supposed to touch corpses. You remember that? So when he kills the lion, he's now become unclean and violated his Nazarite vow. This also sets up an important plot point later on, which we'll see. But then it goes on to say, then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson. So after a while, he returned to marry her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. He scraped it out into his hands and went on, eating as he went. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they ate it, but he didn't tell them that he had taken the honey from the carcass of the lion. Again, why not? Anyone?
Would have been unclean.
Yeah, that's right, because he's now unclean.
He's wrong.
Yep, he's unclean. What he's done has contaminated himself, violated his Nazarite vow, and he didn't care.
And them. He contaminated them.
Exactly right. He's contaminated them. And so he keeps it quiet.
The farmer always has an answer.
So maybe
smart.
you've heard this story in Sunday school, and it's always presented as kind of this heroic thing that Samson takes honey out of a carcass of a lion and doesn't worry about the bees. But in reality, this is not a good thing. This is not a good part of the story. He's violating his oath, and he's disobeying the will of the Lord at this point. It gets better. So. Okay. His father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there as the young men were accustomed to do. And when the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments." Oh yeah. So they said to him, "Ask your riddle, let us hear it." And he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet." But for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. Now the implication here, when it says that Samson made a feast there as the young men were accustomed to do, the implication is that he has violated his vow yet again. Because to make a feast as the young men were accustomed to do meant lots of wine and food and feasting and strong drink. And that would have been especially true in Timnah with all the vineyards. So A feast with the young man in Timnah would have involved drinking much wine. So now he's not only drinking wine, he's doing it with the Philistines, the inhabitants of the land. So he is violating both God's command to the Israelites at the beginning of Judges and the Nazarite vow at the same time. And then he becomes this kind of trickster guy. Maybe after they've all had a little wine, he goes, I got a riddle for you. I'm going to tell you a riddle. And this is typical of a lot of ancient literature. You may remember the riddle of the Sphinx. It's probably the most famous ones of those. In ancient literature, the riddle always seems unfair. It's never a riddle like we think of as a riddle. It's one that only the person asking it is able to understand. The obvious answers here, they spend 3 days trying to think answers. The obvious answers here would have been quite rude. This is either referring to everyone overeating and then vomiting, or it could refer to a bride and groom with sexual overtones. Nevertheless, they can't figure it out. But in ancient literature, the people always use some sort of trickery or deception to figure out the riddle, and that's what happens in this case. So out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. But for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. On the fourth day they said to Samson's wife, coax your husband to explain the riddle to us, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? So Samson's wife wept before him, saying, you hate me. You do not really love me. You've asked a riddle of my people, but you've not explained it to me. And he said to her, look, I haven't told my father or my mother. Why should I tell you? So there's that plot point from earlier. And she wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted. And because she nagged him, on the seventh day he told her. Then she explained the riddle to her people. The men of the town said to him on the seventh day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. So again, we see sort of this bias, narrative bias. You know, a better word than nagged would have been she pressed him for an answer. But we see her playing this poor me, I'm the victim, you don't love me. If you love me, you would tell me. And then when he does, he accuses the Philistines of sleeping with her to get the answer. And so he loses the bet. The trickster's been tricked. And that is also another staple of ancient riddle stories, that the riddler loses the bet and then tries and take revenge. That's what happens here. We're going to stop for questions in just a second. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he went down to Ashkelon. He killed 30 men of the town, took their spoil, and gave the festal garments to those who had explained the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his fathers. Again, the Spirit of the Lord has been given him to do the Lord's work, and he uses the Spirit of the Lord selfishly and inappropriately for personal revenge, not for the deliverance of his people. His anger here is not righteous. His anger here is petty. He has been slighted. He's not happy. He wants revenge. And then we have a twist that leads us to more revenge. In hot anger, he went back to his fathers, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So now this is something that we know, but Samson does not yet know that the woman he wanted to marry, that he was in love with, the father gave him to the best man because of what Samson did. So questions about this episode or comments, anything you want to explain or you want to discuss further?
Does it matter that the Nazarite status was put on him and that he did not take it voluntarily?
Yeah, it matters a lot. You know, the thinking is that if it started before birth, that he would be raised to know that was his destiny and that he was special. But like a lot of teenagers, what his parents want for him is not what he wants for himself. So that's why he doesn't take the vow as strongly as his parents do, and why he really doesn't think twice about violating it. we had great hope for him at the beginning that he was going to be the man that God wanted him to be. And what we see is that he's human. He's extremely human, and that's gonna matter for our concluding thoughts in a little bit. Good question. Other questions or comments? We're almost done. We're not going very much here. All right. So now we know something that Samson does not know, but that's about to change. Samson is about to find out as we go into chapter 15. After a while, at the time of the wheat harvest, so it's been a good amount of time here, Samson went to visit his wife, bringing along a kid. He said, I want to go into my wife's room, but her father wouldn't allow him to go in. Her father said, I was sure that you had rejected her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister prettier than she? Why not take her instead? And Samson said to them, this time when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame. So it seems like maybe during the intervening time, Samson kind of thought about what he had done, felt bad about what he had done. He seems to have some sort of awareness that his earlier actions were wrong. But his conclusion is that, well, okay, this time I'm justified in the violence. This time, one bad turn deserves another, and I'm justified in bringing violence on these people. So he doesn't really learn a lesson from his reflection. So what does he do? Maybe you heard this story in Sunday school. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took some torches, and he turned the foxes tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and olive groves. So if you're trying to picture it, it would have been something like this. He ties these foxes' tails together with a torch on fire in between them. As you can imagine, that would be quite a chaotic scene. It's a very impressive stunt. It takes great imagination and ingenuity for him to come up with it, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the deliverance of the Israelites. It has all to do with personal revenge. He felt slighted, even though he was the one in the wrong. He is feeling slighted here, and he wants to seek revenge, which of course has negative consequences. The Philistines asked who has done this, and they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken Samson's wife and given her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father. That's what they threatened to do earlier, and they got out of it. And we see what kind of people the Philistines are here. They come up and burn her and her father. Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I swear I will not stop until I've taken revenge on you. He struck them down hip and thigh with great slaughter, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock at Etam. So again, it's just one of these things after another. It breeds on itself this cycle of violence and revenge and violence and revenge, and it leads to personal vendettas between Samson and the Philistines, but no action at all on behalf of Israel. So everything that Samson does to slay the Philistines, which we hear about all the time, all the Philistines that Samson slaughters, none of it is done for God. None of it is done to liberate God's people. It's all done because he personally feels slighted. So here we have someone who is elected to be the leader who is a complete and total narcissist. Just saying. So any comments before we get to the messages here that we need to maybe think about?
Oh, it's just feedback and strange stuff. No.
Are you asking a question, Mansell?
No.
All right. All right. So what are the messages?
It points out that vengeance and revenge never works.
Exactly.
It's never, ever a solution.
That's right. And up until this point, that's been part of the story with each one of the judges. There's been some personal revenge. You remember with Deborah and Jael and the tent peg, there was some personal stuff there. But in the scheme of things, it's able to, God is able to move it towards delivering all of his people. By now, the downward spiral is so low that it just, even then, there's nothing good to come out of this at all for the people. It's all personal. So here are the messages that I came up with that I'd like for us to think about. Number one, the real hero in this story is Samson's mother. She's the one who's faithful. She is the model of attentiveness to God and to God's word. It's interesting to me that she's never named. The father's named immediately in the story. Manoah means rest or peace. So we have this idea that we're in a time of rest, and we expect the story to be about the father and about how his son is going to bring peace. But as we get through the story of birth, he's actually the buffoon. He's actually the clown in the story. And the mother is the one who is the hero. Now, I don't know what to make of the fact that she doesn't have a name. We've had a couple of women unnamed. Jephthah's daughter was not named, and she was a victim. But then we had that woman with the millstone that dropped it on Abimelech's head, who's a hero. So there's no clear message in the book about what it means to not have a name. It could be that we're seeing some role reversal. You know, the Bible is full of stories of we expect one thing and we get another. And so we expect the named man to be the hero of the story. It's actually the unnamed woman that's the hero of the story. We expect this special child to be the hero of the story. It's actually the woman who is so unspecial that she doesn't even have a name, that she's the hero of the story. And there could also be some parallel here with the fact that the angel isn't named. So the angel doesn't have a name, neither does the mother, and they're the ones who are doing the Lord's business. Whatever the reason, we're supposed to see her as a hero, as a positive role model. She is faithful to God. She listens to God. She listens to the angel. The angel appears to her. Even when the husband asks the Lord to send the angel back, the angel comes to her and not the husband. She is the more intelligent and alert of the couple. When Manoah asks about the boy's fate, the angel says, look, I already told your wife, listen to her. She knows what she's talking about. When Manoah realizes it's an angel and freaks out and says, oh my God, we're going to die. She's like, look, if God wanted to kill us, he wouldn't have done all this for us. Be cool. So if there's a faithful hero in this story, it appears to be the mother. And that's the first point. I was going to say something about my mother, but she's not there. She disappeared. Number two, how are we going to use the gifts that God gives us? This story shows us that being blessed by God, being gifted by the Spirit of the Lord is no guarantee that we will fulfill God's purposes. The presence of God doesn't guarantee success in our lives. There's also something of our actions. Success is dependent upon our actions. You'll remember back the first judge, Othniel, gets the Spirit of the Lord and immediately has success. Gideon, his success is delayed. Jephthah has even less success that is more delayed. Each one of these judges asserts their own will and their own agenda. And when we get to Samson, he's going to be the least successful of all because he completely fails to demonstrate the proper response to being blessed by God or gifted by God. He's completely focused on himself and what he wants. So that's a cautionary tale for us. God gives us gifts that we are to use in accordance with his calling, but it's up to us whether we're going to use them properly or not. God's not going to take away our freedom to choose. God loves us enough that he's not going to override our free will. Free will is a big deal to God. So we have to know that the fact that we are sinful, and this is where Calvin's theology comes into play, the fact that we are sinful means that we are usually going to choose self over God. So we have to keep working on our discipleship in order to correct that so that we can use our gifts for God's glory, not for our own. God values our freedom. He's not going to prevent us from misusing the gifts that he gives us. Sometimes, as we see in Scripture, God will discipline people for not using their gifts. Nevertheless, God continues to choose to work through human beings, even though we're flawed and don't use our gifts properly. And that's the third point, is that God chooses to work incarnationally. We see over and over and over again, God chooses to work through human beings to accomplish his will. We've got Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Joseph, Moses, Miriam. God uses the resources at his disposal. And as flawed as we may be, we are the greatest resources that God has available to achieve his will. And so what this story teaches us is even when we're unfaithful, like Samson, God can still redeem that. God can still work in the midst of that. Even when we assert ourselves, God can still use us as instruments of his will. Now, that doesn't excuse what Samson does. It doesn't excuse what we do, but it does let us know that in spite of our sinfulness, God still chooses to work through us because we're the best thing that God has. We're the best instruments that God has to use. So as we read this story, just the very fact that this reckless, oversexed, unfaithful guy named Samson can even begin to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines is a testimony to God's faithfulness and to God's grace. And in that respect, Samson's story mirrors the entire biblical story, where we see that every moment of God's mission is carried forward not by human faithfulness, but by God's faithfulness in spite of human faithlessness. So if there's a hero of the story other than Samson's mother, it's God. God is the hero of this story. He's persistently faithful to Samson, despite Samson's persistent unfaithfulness. He's persistently faithful to his people, despite their persistent unfaithfulness. And the good news for us is that he's persistently faithful to us, despite our persistent unfaithfulness. God remains faithful to us. God chooses to work through us and to gift us for that calling on our lives. He's not going to override our free will to do that. What he wants is for us to conform our will to his, and that's the discipleship journey, learning more and more to conform our will to God so that we can use our gifts for God's purposes. And of course, the ultimate form of that happens in Jesus, whose will is perfectly aligned with God. Jesus is perfectly faithful. He never asserts his own will. So he, out of everyone that we see, is able to finally perfectly deliver and redeem us from the oppression of sin. So those would be the three things that I think are here. The real hero in this part of the story is Samson's mother. Pay attention to what she does. It's more important than what he does. It makes us question how we're going to use the gifts that God gives us. Are we going to use our gifts faithfully or irresponsibly? And in spite of us choosing wrong most of the time, God continues to choose to work through us because we are the best thing that God has going. All right. So questions or comments?
How do the Jews view Samson?
Well, as a flawed hero. Yeah. Christians make way more about it than
I'll
Jews.
sit back to the potatoes. I'll put our fish in now. Okay, it'll take about 10 minutes for that to cook.
All right. I'm going to mute everybody again. All right, so I can see you. Raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. So the Jews see him as a very flawed hero, just one in a long line of failed judges. They don't idolize him the way we do, or the way Christians have, especially the Christians that tend to see Samson as a prefiguring of Christ in the Old Testament. They're just ignoring the whole context of the story and just looking at 2 or 3 aspects of the story. But I just get tickled every time I see all these books about Samson that are written for children talking about what a hero he is. He's not that at all, especially what we're going to see next week. It gets really bad. This is the good stuff. This is the beginning. He gets worse as we go. And the Jews, I think, recognize that. But I think the Jews are really good. Jewish people are really good at recognizing the sheer humanity that are in the Hebrew scriptures. All of God's people that he chooses to use are deeply flawed in so many ways, all throughout the scriptures. And that continues when we get to the Kings with Solomon and David and Saul, just deeply flawed people who were still used by God. There's not really this idea in the Jewish faith, like we have in the Christian faith, that if God is going to use you, you must be perfect and sanctimonious and righteous and they are more in line of, no, God uses ordinary, normal people, flaws and all. Sometimes the flaws make it even better because it's God that's glorified and not people. There are no saints in Judaism like there are in Catholicism, for instance. That's a good question. Other questions? Unmute yourself or raise your hand if you have one. All right, I'm not seeing much. So what about, show of hands, how many of you knew that the full story of Samson? How many of you are surprised to see some of that stuff that's stuff that you haven't heard before? Yeah, I think most people are because we just get the Sunday school hero stories and we don't get that other stuff often. Anything else? Yes, Tuesday? Oh, your mind is blown. Okay.
Yes. I'm really disappointed.
Mom, you got up and left for just a second when I was talking about how the hero of the story is the mother. I wanted to see what you thought about that.
I definitely think she was.
She was the only faithful one.
Yeah. Well, that's true. She got it from the beginning. She knew. Yeah. I mean, didn't.
You're right. Yeah. All right. So the moral of the story is always listen to your mother.
That's
Yep.
right.
Moral of the story is women are always right.
That's right.
My mother always said, you'll get in trouble if you don't do what I tell you to do. It's usually right.
Yep.
I always told him I had eyes in the back of my head, and I do.
All right. Well,
my mother's learned that her daughter's coming down this Friday for the weekend. So that means she's going to sneak out to the store. That's what that means.
oh yeah.
Oh.
Well, tell her to be careful. Wear a mask. All right. Well, so next week we'll finish Samson's story. We'll get to Delilah. Delilah is just a very small part of Samson's story at the end of it. She's not a huge character the way movies and songs make her out to be. But she is his undoing ultimately, and we'll see what happens there. So next week he's still got another woman. He's gonna fall in love with a prostitute first, and then he's gonna fall in love with Delilah. So again, this is not rated PG stuff that we're going through. And then we'll look at the fallout from Samson in the last week. So with that said, I'll pronounce the benediction and say, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Glad to have everybody here. It's good to see your faces. And if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. All right, go in peace. Bye.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
Toodles.
Oh. Oh.